I will fulfill your wish to be informed about the origin of this business, and you will see that the stocks do not exist merely for fools, but also for intelligent people. In 1602, a few Dutch merchants founded a company. The wealthiest people in the country took interest in it, and a total capital of 64 and a third tons of gold, or more than 6.4 million florins, was raised. Several ships were built, and in 1604 were sent out to seek adventure quixote-like in the East Indies. The property of the company was broken into several parts, and each part, called an acte share, carrying the possibility of acting upon, or laying claim to, the surplus or profits, amounted to £500, or 3,000 florins. There were many, however, who did not subscribe to a whole share, but took only a smaller portion according to their wealth, inclination, or expectation of the future. The ships sailed their courses without encountering windmills or enchanted giants. Their successful voyages, their victorious conquests, and the rich return cargoes meant that Caesar's Veni Vidi Vici undertakings was surpassed, and that a tiny profit was made, which became a stimulus to further undertakings. The first distribution of the profits was postponed till 1612, in order to increase the company's capital. Then the administration distributed 57.5%, while in 1613 the dividends amounted to 42.5%, so that the shareholders, after having had their capital paid back to them, could enjoy any further return as so much velvet. Gradually, the company developed to such an extent that it surpassed the most brilliant enterprises which have ever been famous in the history of the world. Every year new shipments and new riches arrive, the proceeds from which are distributed as profits, or are utilized in expenditures in accordance with the stipulations of the administration. The dividends are sometimes paid in clothes, sometimes in promissory notes, at other times in money, just as the directors think fit. From the founding of the company to the date of this conversation, 1688, the dividends have amounted to 1,482.5%, while the value of the capital has increased more than fivefold. This treasure is compared to a tree, because it yields fruit almost every year, and although during some years it has only produced blossoms, there have been other years when it has resembled the trees of Uraba, which display their fruitfulness 2 or 3 times a year, and which competed with the Sibyllines, whose branches were of gold, and whose leaves were of emeralds. Others call the company the tree of knowledge of good and evil, such as exists in paradise, because it is kept informed of everything that happens along all the branches of its interests. However, I have come to see that it resembles the tree of life, because innumerable men earn their living in its shadow, and those who are satisfied with the fruits, and do not insist on pulling up the roots, will admit that they do pretty well in such a business. I think I have fully grasped usque ad ultimus differentias, the meaning of the company, its shares, its principles, its reputation, its splendor, its initiation, its progress, its administration, the distribution of profits, and its stability. But what has this to do with that mysterious business you mentioned, with the tricks that you pointed out, with the difficulties you emphasized, with the entire exclusion of risk, with the changing of names, and with other exaggerations and expressions which have filled me with perplexity, rapture, and confusion? Let me return to my assertions, that this business of mine is a mysterious affair, and that even as it was the most fair and noble in all of Europe, so it was also the falsest and most infamous business in the world. The truth of this paradox becomes incomprehensible when one appreciates that this business has necessarily been converted into a gain, and merchants concerned in it have become speculators. Had the conversion of these merchants into speculators been the only change, the harm would have been bearable. But what is worse, a portion of the stockbrokers have become card sharpers, and though they are familiar with the blossoms, they nevertheless lose the fruits. For a better understanding of this notable fact, it should be observed that three classes of men are to be extinguished on the stock exchange. The princes of the business belong to the first class, the merchants to the second, and the speculators to the last. Every year the financial lords and the big capitalists enjoy the dividends from the shares that they have inherited or have bought with money of their own. They do not care about movements in the price of the stock, since their interest lies not in the sale of the stock, but in the revenues secured through the dividends. The higher value of the shares forms only an imaginary enjoyment of them, arising from the reflection that they could in truth obtain a high price if they were to sell their shares. The second class is formed of merchants, who buy a share of £500 and have it transferred on their name, because they are expecting favourable news from India or of a peace treaty in Europe. They sell these shares when their anticipation comes true and when the price rises, or they buy shares against cash but try to sell them immediately for delivery at a later date, when the price will be higher, i.e., for which date a higher price is already quoted. They do this from fear of changes in the political or economic situation, or of the arrival of unfavourable information, and are satisfied with what amounts to the interest on their temporarily invested money. They consider their risk as much as their profit. They prefer to gain little, but to gain that little with relative security, to incur no risk other than the solvency of the other party in this forward contract, and to have no worries other than those bound up with unforeseen events. Gamblers and speculators belong to the third class. They have tried to decide all by themselves about the magnitude of their gains, and in order to do so, they have put up wheels of fortune. Oh, what double dealers! Oh, what an order of life has been created by these schemers! The labyrinth of Crete was no more complicated than the labyrinth of their plans. They buy 1 or 20 shares. The latter commitment is usually called a regiment. And when the 20th of the month approaches, the date of delivery, there are only three possible means of settlement. First, there is the sale of the shares, through which profit or loss will rise according to the purchase price. Then there is a hypothecation of the shares to 4/5 of their value, which is done even by the wealthiest traders without harm to their credit. And finally, the buyer may have the shares transferred to his name and make the purchase price payable at the bank, which can be done only by very wealthy people, because a regiment today costs more than 100,000 ducats. When the date of settlement draws near, and if the shares can neither be taken up by the purchaser nor be hypothecated, they must be sold. The speculators for a decline in the prices, i.e. the bears, are aware of this impasse and try to bring about a sudden fall in the price in order to cause the shares to be sold below purchase price. Thus serious difficulties may arise for some of the speculators. Several among those who are in difficulties, immoral people of course, know how to free themselves through the following argument. The buyer is not obliged to pay for that which is bought. I lose in the purchase, therefore I am not obliged to pay. Ghastly tupidity, unheard of madness, frightful folly. You assert that the speculator is not obliged to pay for his purchases, but I do not understand the reason for the lack of obligation. I doubt whether he can appeal to a judicial authority such as Bartolus or Baldus. This is the chief point and substance of the whole business. Of such complications will not even your tales know anything, and from your Socrates one could only learn the wisdom that we do not know anything. Therefore I inform you that Solon is not alone as the giver of good laws. Frederick Henry too, a shining star in the house of Orange-Nassau, promulgated with wise motives an ordinance for these provinces, according to which he who sold shares for future delivery, without putting them on the time account, should be exposed to the danger, because he has sold something he does not own, that the buyer will not take the pieces at the time fixed upon. When the speculators look through for protection through this recourse, which is called Appeal to Frederick, in accordance with the name of that famous governor, the storm stopped, the attack ceased, and the disturbance died down.